Hello everyone. Today we're going to be looking at our last presentation for period 2 of the APUSH curriculum, and it's focusing on the Atlantic slave trade in British America. So we've touched on the subject a little bit across many of the other lectures in this historical period. This one's going to be focused specifically on putting that all together so we can study it in a more focused way. There we go. Alright, so if you look at the description for this entire presentation, it's looking at how all European empires participated in the Atlantic slave trade, but within the English colonies, slavery developed into a system that depended on the regional peculiarities of the different regions. And you can see that in actually that really long part A that you have there on the far left. What's going on here is it's defining how in these different regions of the British colonies, slavery develops to varying degrees. So just to go over this very briefly, notice how it says in New England there was relatively few enslaved laborers. Just call them slaves, that's what they were. It then mentions indentured servants, and then it talks about how in the Chesapeake and southernmost Atlantic coast there were much larger numbers, and most slaves were actually sent to the West Indies. It was something like 80–90% of those coming from Africa. Okay, so let's look at what the slave trade was like. Now, one thing that you need to know is about just that that passage over from Africa. So most of the Africans that were captured by these slave traders were men, and that had to do with the fact that these people were going to be used as slaves working in manual labor. Okay, so the idea was that they were looking to capture and enslave people who had more physical capabilities. They did enslave some women, but often the goal of enslaving women was so that they could work in the house, do light work in the fields, or they could be used to create more slaves, because the way slavery worked with African slavery in the Americas was that any offspring of African women were also slaves and also the owner's property. Okay, so the trip across the Atlantic, so one of those parts of the triangle, the South Atlantic trade, was called the Middle Passage. So it's kind of like, it's called the Middle Passage because it's the one in the middle between Africa and the Americas. So, little about it, really horrific conditions. You can see on that picture, or rather that diagram on the top right of your screen, that represented how they really crammed as many people below decks to transport as they could. So oftentimes they would be put in basically shelves and shackled to the shelves so they couldn't move. Okay, so it was they'd even refer to the slaves as cargo in order to dehumanize them. The only times they would take them out from under the decks would be to bring them up on deck for a little bit, to move around to keep the muscles from atrophying. And otherwise, that's where they were. Okay, that's where they would eat, that's where they would sleep, that's where they would go to the bathroom. And if you think they're on shelves, if you're on the bottom, think of all the stuff that's coming down from you on top. Now, what that meant is many died on the ship because of the poor sanitary conditions. The thing was, for the slavers, the people selling the slaves, they weren't as concerned about that because they knew that they could still turn a profit from each ship if 50% of the slaves died. Okay, so essentially they weren't looking at these Africans as people, they looked at them as property, as cargo, and didn't really care if they died at all. Okay, so horrific conditions on that physical side, but then think about that kind of psychological side as well, of basically making these people property instead of human beings. So once they got to the Americas, what were the working conditions like? Not very good. So 10+ hours a day of manual, brutal work in the southern heat. Remember, the South, and then down the West Indies was where you could grow cash crops. Up in New England, where the climate was a bit more temperate, it didn't have the climate to grow things that were demanded very highly in Europe. So, brutal work, so cultivating tobacco, sugar, rice, indigo, major cash crops. And if sort of that physical side wasn't enough of just the work, there was also a lot of what we call mental and physical abuse. So mental abuse in terms of subjugating these people and making them feel that they were useless, that they were property. And on the other side, there was physical abuse, especially of the female slaves as well. So what happened there is oftentimes the masters would rape their female slaves. That was very common. And they said, well, they're my property. I can do whatever I want with them. Okay, so think of that. For men, it was bad that they were going to basically work to death, especially in the West Indies. For women, it meant sexual abuse was probably the worst part of their conditions. Okay, let's talk about where it was, where slavery was largest in the Chesapeake Bay and the Carolinas. If you look to that map on the right side of the screen that shows you a percentage of the population, and notice as it goes, as you go further south, the percentage of the local population that was slave got higher and higher because the climate was more useful for growing cash crops. Okay, so mercantilism as a system needed slavery, right? Because it needed to grow these cash crops in order to make triangle trade successful. But as you get further north, the regions are not dependent on it as the South and the West Indies were. They still participated in the system, they benefited from it, but they weren't directly involved in it. Okay, we talked about this a little bit before, the shift from indentured servitude to slavery. This had social and economic origins. Socially, by getting rid of indentured servitude, which had white people, and shifting to African slavery, it brought unity among whites. So because of Bacon's rebellion and they saw the troubles of, well, what happens when whites feel marginalized, they also feel like they have more natural rights. They're going to rise up against those in power. But if you unite the poor whites, the middle class whites, and the rich whites against blacks as an entire class, as slaves, then you're going to bring social unity where everyone supports the slave system rather than opposing the 1% at the top. Economically, I mentioned mercantilism before, it fits in there. But remember, and I think I said this at some point before, that the supply of indentured servants was decreasing as it became cheaper for Europeans to travel to the New World. And also slavery, now that it's being involved in this sort of mass scale with the Middle Passage, slaves became cheaper over time as well. All right, next up is looking at chattel slavery. I've definitely used this term before. Here's a whole slide dedicated to studying it. So, when we define chattel slavery, I mean, I'm sure you've seen the word chattel or slavery before, but not the word chattel. It means slavery is passed down to descendants, and that makes them property, not people, from a legal standpoint. I said before that how this is different from forms of slavery that happened in like ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and how you could sort of buy your freedom. That was not possible with chattel slavery. Okay, the African slave trade was defined by race. Just mentioned that already. And what this creates is this color line, where what that meant is that if think of like slavery in ancient Rome, it was essentially people with white skin enslaving other people of white skin. It was difficult to tell the difference between if you were free or if you were slave. With race acting as this clear mark of the definition of slavery in the Americas, there was no way to escape it. And you can see how this kind of breeds sort of social tensions and racism and all these things, because race began as a mark of someone being inferior and subjugated. So remember, that's the color line, and it's different from past forms of slavery. Okay, I mentioned this on the last slide, that having slavery defined by race also limited class tensions among whites, where they were united by race rather than by economic status. And that was always a worry among the very wealthy, is what would happen if the poor laboring whites figured out that their social status was a lot closer to slaves than it was to the very wealthy at the top. Okay, and that's slavery worked as this means of control of economic classes at the time. Okay, now as you get further south and as we progress with slavery developing as a larger system out within the Americas, a racial hierarchy developed and it became much more strict. Okay, now here was the issue why many in the South wanted this, is if you had a larger proportion of slaves to whites in your region, think of the greater danger if they figured out they could rebel. What if slaves figured out that they were 50, 60, 70% of the local population? There was strength in numbers. So by creating laws that limited the abilities and anything slaves could do, that meant that there was a lower possibility of them uniting together. Remember when we look at race down in Spanish and Portugal holdings in the Americas, intermarriage was allowed, and that maintained control because it created kind of a more stratified racial hierarchy. While we have in the British colonies, there's basically white and black, and in between you were more or less considered black, okay, by definition legally. Okay. Economic needs for this developing cash crop economy demanded subjugation, and we're going to see as we get closer to the Civil War that it develops and grows all the way up till 1860 if you look at the data. All right, our final slide is looking at the African American community itself as it's developing within this dehumanizing system of slavery. Okay, there is resistance, but there's also attempts within the community to make life a little bit better, at least in routines and traditions. So this community emerges. Slavers, of course, tried to prevent this. What they would often do is, if they were buying new slaves coming from Africa, they would know the background of the slaves they currently have and find slaves that came from different tribes, different regions, that spoke different languages or had different religions, so that when all the slaves on their plantation were working together, they were less likely to unite and potentially rise up. So if they had communication problems, that's going to create problems in opposing those that are subjugating you. Okay? African and American traditions kind of merge as well, because what would happen eventually, even though the slavers tried to prevent this, was that the slaves would start communicating, start to learn each other's language, learn each other's traditions, learn each other's what they would eat, how, things they celebrated, and once they saw their condition was the same, they started to unite rather than oppose. And what happens is kind of this the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, is how I think of it. You have all these African traditions, you have British traditions, you have some Native American traditions even, and they all merged into something that's distinctly African American, whether it's slang, whether it's traditions, some that exist to this very day, developed out of slave communities all the way back when our country was still British. Okay, so let's look at these means of resistance that are mentioned in the descriptor to the left. Now, they were usually passive, and that's what we mean by covert means. So things that were going to make life a little bit easier for the slaves for how they were working every day, but not getting them punished to a great extent. So what they would do is they would break their tools when the overseers weren't looking. So they'd say, "Oh, I can't work, my tool's broke." And basically, until they could get another tool or machinery, they weren't going to be able to work. They would try to work at a slower pace because they knew that if they worked at a fast pace, they'd get tired more quickly, and some would run away. I would say running away is kind of a borderline between overt and covert. As slavery develops and families are split apart by the institution, many were actually running away to go and find their family members if they were sold. Okay, so there's some passive means. Now let's look at these more active means. So a good sort of proper term that goes with this was the Stono Rebellion in 1739. It's happened in South Carolina, and we're going to find this is one of these early slave rebellions in American history that's at a larger scale. But it's going to follow the same process for pretty much every other slave rebellion we look at. It starts with one slave having this idea on one plantation, rallying his own fellow slaves on the plantation where he works, first going to their plantation, killing the owners, and then taking that group of slaves, going to another plantation, killing the master there, recruiting other slaves, and trying to travel plantation to plantation. Now what happens, as happens with all large-scale slave rebellions, this one failed, and these rebellions always lead to stricter slave laws. In this case, and in many cases, it could be limitations on religion, so practicing religion, limitations on marriage, limitations on travel, and education. The idea here was that sometimes religion would bring about ideas focused on liberation. Marriage felt like you were building a community. Travel, if travel was limited, that meant if you were black and walking along the road, something was off. And education, if slaves were prevented from reading, that means that they could not learn just how subjugated they really were. Okay, let's look at kind of part of the community that's developing within the sort of the slave communities within the U.S. or not the U.S. The British colonies at the time. One thing to know about them in religious terms was that blacks were often marginalized by the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church was this large, not just religious, but political structure. Remember, the Church of England is very powerful as an institution as well. So what happened is, as new Protestant denominations came over to the colonies at the time, not only poor whites, but blacks as well were attracted to this because it had new ideas that weren't going to marginalize them. So adult baptism, so that means being born again. So even if you were a slave from Africa, that you weren't born into Christianity, but you discovered it later on, you could be born again. All your sins could be washed away, and you're a new person who's going to be saved by God. Okay? So you can see why that appealed to slaves. They felt that we may not be equal in the eyes of this earthly realm, but we're going to be equal in the eyes of God. And you can see why that made many southern states restrict access to preachers and religious revivals for many African Americans. Because suddenly, if they felt they were equal, they weren't being subjugated as much as the system that the South worked so hard to create in the first place. Okay, so you can see it's this constant back and forth of trying to establish a community with new traditions and then being pushed down, subjugated by the powers that be to prevent any sense of autonomy or sense of, being your own person and being equal. Got a little extra time. The word subjugate, I say that word a lot, okay, because it's a good word for defining what was happening to especially slaves at the time in the British colonies. If you break down the word, sub means below or inferior, right? And jug or jugate is a verb it's a verb form of what you're doing with laws. So think like judicial, jury, all these words that kind of have that same root. You're using the laws to make one group of people inferior. That's what subjugate means. So not just viewed as inferior, but legally inferior. That's a good term to know. Alright, thanks for watching as always. There are your next steps. So keep up with your work, don't fall behind, and I will see you next time.